All right, everybody. So now we're going to get started on the second half of part four. I just wanted to let you guys know that I didn't include the McCoy Hotel, so you don't have to worry about that one. If you read it, that's cool. But the McCoy Hotel, I just decided to just take it out and we'll just forget about it. So we'll just focus on the last two chapters being the last three chapters being the Comstock journals, the bike, and of course, the castle. So here we go. So the prologue for the Comstock Journals is by Olivia Castellano. I don't think I have a picture of her, but we can clearly understand that even with the name, let me get my laser pointer one more time. So even with the name Olivia, it's very similar to Olivia. So we know that the author Olivia Castellano is it's a reflection of her in third person, in a third person perspective, psychoanalytical story. So why I mention psychoanalytical instead of autobiographical is because the story is kind of weird. This story is definitely a little bit transcendent and trippy, for lack of a better word. So, in essence, Olivia, the actual author, created this fictionalized town where she defies history and the challenges that a Borderlands identity creates within her, especially in childhood. So notice that the word Borderlands is here because Olivia deals with this Borderlands feeling of growing up in Texas, being Chicana, and figuring out her identity in this Borderlands childhood that she describes in the abstract before the beginning of this story. So one way she does this is she uses escapism really well. This story isn't one of my favorites, but one thing that she uses really well is escapism. And we've mentioned before that escapism is escaping, right, a reality into an imagination of sorts. So we mentioned escapism being really prevalent when you go to the movies, when you go to the movie theaters. But for her, escapism was to escape. Right? She says, I invented a blue garden on a horse with enormous wings. So right off the bat, we can tell in the book that she really uses her imagination to escape, to figure out, where she is in life and in her town. And one thing to remember is that she's young. So when she's referencing herself in third person in this story, we can kind of conclude that she's around 8 years old. So notice that her age plays a factor in how fantastical and how creative and how imaginative her descriptions of these fantasy things are like, because she is actually still pretty young. She says on page 221, to escape, I invented a winged horse, blue horse of dreams, so that I could ride high above South Texas to see what else I could be. So the geography, again, this is why she deals with borderlands, because in our geographic location, she is by a border. She is living in South Texas, and she wants to imagine what life would be like outside of that kind of a borderland. Olivia, or Olivia in the story, imaginatively describes how the fictitious town of Comstock, Texas molded her as an 8-year-old. So again, 8 years old, she's relying on the perspective of being 8 years old, but using her imagination to describe a fictitious town because she grew up in South Texas. But she fictionalizes her actual neighborhood of where she grew up in to this fantasy neighborhood called Comstock. As she began to grow up, she realized she was becoming too big for the town. So she describes literally on page 221 that she needed to escape because she felt like a big fish in a small pond, so to speak. She felt like she needed to experience something more. She was too confined in this town that she grew up in. So what does she do in order to really branch out and escape imaginatively from this town? Well, she humanizes it. The other character in this story is her fictionalized town of Comstock. she feminizes the fantastical city. So she does give it a name, and it's a she pronoun, I guess you can say. And she credits Comstock, the little town that she fictionalizes based off of her real town in Texas, to her grandpa. So we're kind of coming full circle here, where a grandparent is a huge influence on Olivia as she is at a young age when she's 8 years old. Her grandpa was a great influence to her dreamlike imagination as a child. And if you look through the book, she really starts to bring out memories of her grandpa on page 222. She credits a lot of that influence, a lot of that childhood upbringing to her grandfather. So, as we've noticed, right, some of the stories deal with some kind of life-changing event. For Olivia, she undergoes a life-changing identity crisis. This is where the story gets kind of psychoanalytical. Her breakdown in this story is much more complicated and much more psychodynamic than the breakdown that Thelma Reina dealt with when she was describing her parents' divorce in the story. So one reason why this story by Olivia is kind of very odd is that she gives us like a really raw breakdown of this like literal identity crisis that she goes through. But she comes out of it with this sense of love and appreciation for her grandpa. And again, I can't stress enough how important love is in the stories that we've been through. So with this story, the love for her grandpa and the love of God, right, this relationship that she ended up having to build in order to lift herself out of this really awful identity crisis. I mean, you read the story. We don't have to go through it. It's very intense. But one way that she credits getting out of that frenzy, out of this really bad identity crisis, is mustering up the courage in faith, really transcending all that she went through with accepting that God saved her from a lot of distress that she was dealing with. And of course, her grandpa was a huge influence as well. So I didn't want to get too much into detail about the Comstock journals because, again, it's not one of my favorites. But just the overall essence of love is very important in that story. So just get out of that for Olivia, although she wanted to really escape the town, she still had to learn to love it and love herself. So onward with The Bike. So The Bike by Gary Soto is very short. I'm sure it was one of your guys' favorite stories. But it's very clever. And one of the reasons why I like this story is because we can all relate to how Gary Soto describes this summer that he had when he was 5 years old with disobeying his mother. So here's little Gary Soto on a bike. So Gary brings to life the memory of his playful, curious, and defiant childhood. So one thing, let me find my water bottle. Can't find it. Anyway, one thing that Gary brings to life is his playful memories. He's very curious, very defiant, and we can all relate to being like this, maybe at 5 years old or, more in our childhood. 5-year-old Gary has a childhood mindset of invincibility, silliness, and playful adventure. He really captures the essence of being 5 years old in this story. There's this sense of invincibility that we innately feel that we can own when we're young. You all might still be living through it because you guys are still very young. But in my old age now, it's not so much anymore. After a certain age, as you will get older and you will realize, you start to realize that you are not invincible. Life is very short, and when you get hurt, it takes longer to heal. So for the mindset that Gary had when he was 5, it was just so, foreign to him that, he could get hurt, he could, be injured to the point where he could, have a really bad consequence. No. All of that was thrown out the window. He really relied on being invincible, silly, and just being playful and curious. The location and imagery that Gary used in this story are very effective, right? So when you're reading this story, you are on that street, right? You are in the house with his mom. You hear his mom telling him, don't go anywhere where I can't see you, right? Stay here. Don't go to that crazy street. What was it called? Sarah Street. Don't go onto that curve. But he defies her, right? Although the imagery and location are very essential to the story, it's also the communication that the mom has with Gary at 5 years old that takes us back to a moment where maybe our moms talk to us the same way. So what I liked about the story and what I wanted you guys to get out of it is that the childhood freedom is very palpable. Palpable means very visceral. You can feel it. You can feel the kind of freedom that he wanted to have riding his bike and disobeying his mom. So you feel that. You feel that he's having a lot of fun. So in this case, what will your childhood mindset be in terms of thinking back to your 5-year-old self, right? What were some things that really stick out to you when you were 5 years old? And Gary really had to think about what his mindset was with writing this story. Although it was very simple, very short, it probably was a lot harder for him to evoke all of these feelings because he knew exactly what he wanted to write about. So one thing that I related to this story and I like to share with my students is that when I was 5 years old, I had a very terrible bike accident. Not as bad as Gary's when he was little, but so my grandma used to have a 2-wheeler bicycle, and we went over to her house one day, and my mom wanted to ride it, so she put me on the back, the second, little seat, and she sat on the front. And she wanted to go around the block. So I think I was literally about 5 years old. And so my mom was cycling, right? She was pedaling, I was pedaling, and I got tired. So I stopped pedaling because my feet were tired, whereas my mom kept going. So she was pedaling, and I felt tired, so I let my feet dangle, but she was still cycling. So my left foot, got caught in the chain as my mom was still riding off. It was just like my ankle that really got severed. So I cried, I screamed, and she realized something was wrong, and she lifted me off of the bicycle, and my left ankle was a bloody mess. I got rushed to the ER, I got stitches, and now if you look closely at my ankle, I have terrible scar tissue. It's a very big scar, so it's very noticeable when I wear sandals and shorts or a skirt or a dress. It catches people's attention. They ask me what happened, and sometimes I forget I have the scar. Like I don't even remember it. But it's not until someone sees it and asks, "Wow, like that's really bad. What happened?" Well, I told them I had this really bad childhood memory when I was 5 years old riding a bike, and those childhood memories stick to you, and this one really stuck to Gary, and that's what made his short story very very palpable, very relatable, very real. Lastly, we have The Castle. The Castle by Ron Arias is about a very unlikely friendship between a young boy and a king. So this story, although again it's very simple and very similar to Gary's, Gary again wrote from the perspective of that 5-year-old, which is very hard to do, but he does very effectively. Ron Arias does the same thing. He writes from the perspective of a child. He writes about his childhood perspective. So you have this young boy. What was his name? Carlos, right? I think his name was Carlos. Yes. So he, I think, personifies himself in the story. Carlos's childhood imagination viewed Sam the man that he goes and plays with as a king living on a castle on the hill. But in reality, and I hope that you guys caught this while you were reading the story, Sam is actually homeless. He is a homeless man living in his encampment. For Carlos, he didn't see it that way, right? He really thought that Sam was just this king. He lived on a hill. He didn't have property. The land was his property. So what happened with Carlos, and why did he think that? Why did he think that there was this man who lived in a castle and really thought that he was the king and he was helping him, protect him, Carlos, right here we have Carlos, and pretend this is Sam, the king, why he was helping him against these really big bullies who would make fun of Sam and Carlos and their friendship. Well, one thing to remember is that Carlos was going up to that hill in defiance to his mom. So there we go. We have the similarity between Gary and, Gary's childhood bike story to Carlos. They both defied their mom. But the reason why Carlos defied his mom was because he was going through a lot of tough stuff at home. Right? His dad wasn't in the picture. He didn't know when his dad was going to come home, so that really impacted his upbringing. Not having a father figure in a young boy's life, and guys in the class, if you can relate to this, it's very tough. It's very rough on a young child who's a male to not have a father figure to look up to. So it was a place for Carlos to escape the search for his father. It was a place where Carlos used escapism, right? The same theme that we've heard so far, to rid of himself from his reality, his very sad reality. So Carlos befriends Sam, right? This homeless man, and they both create an imaginative world where they are royalty on the hill. So they make their own fantasy. Sam accompanies Carlos on his imaginative childhood playfulness. Now, don't interpret it as something perverted or weird. It really was, Sam being kind of like this father figure to Carlos, if not a father figure, just a friend, just someone to talk to. And he meant no harm to Carlos, right? He probably had a sense that there was something wrong happening in his life, and that's why he wanted to befriend someone like Sam. So, along with sensory detail and very immersive childhood memories by Ron Arias, we are transported into this place of fantasy, which is the biggest thing to get out of the story. Being transported to some fictional, imaginative land is hard to do for a writer, but to kind of execute it in this way and to realize that, like, oh wait, Sam is homeless. It just, it peeks into that childhood imagination and helps us understand the world that we can create when we're young. When we're little, our imagination kind of takes over our reality sometimes. So for Ron Arias to really get this through the story is a sign of a great storyteller. All right, guys, so that's the end of part 4. And take notes and be well aware that we still have more readings to go through throughout the rest of the semester. All right, see you during our next lecture.